Hello and welcome to an essay plan that is going to compare tissue with Ozymandias. This video will show you how to compare the two poems effectively. There's lots of videos that will do a really good job of analysing each poem in isolation, which is important, but that is only step one. Step two is to compare the two poems, which means to write about their similarities and their differences. That is what the examiner wants. Now you can compare tissue with whatever poem you want. These poems were never meant to be compared, but for some reason I can just really imagine comparing it really well with Ozymandias. All of those key ideas that come up throughout the anthology seem to really gel together really well between these two poems. Now, Tissue has got to be, along with Exposure, my favourite poem in the whole anthology. I think there's so much going on here, and so this plan will go into quite a lot of detail and quite a lot of depth. I think I've got in total 7 suggested paragraphs that you could write up, which is about 2 essays worth. So let's have a look at them all. The first thing that I would do, everybody, if I opened the exam paper, and this is the question that I got, compare how poets present ideas about power in Tissue and in one other poem, this is what I would start off with. I'd start off with a paragraph that analyses the titles. The titles of both poems emphasise the fragility of human power, suggesting that human power is something that is fragile. What's my evidence for this, examiner? Well, tissue, both as paper but also living tissue and skin, which is kind of also emphasised by the final isolated line of the poem, are both fragile things. If we work on the presumption, everybody, that the whole poem is a metaphor for human power, and therefore tissue isn't just relating to paper tissue, which she uses as a metaphor for power, but also therefore combines it with the idea of human power and therefore human tissue. Surely this title, this one word, can be analysed by saying that both are fragile, both are, as it were, breakable or easily damaged, and yet capable of conveying such incredible power. And then my paragraph would continue by analysing the title of the poem Ozymandias, which we might know is a poem based on the famous Egyptian ruler Ramesses II. My understanding, everybody, is that Ozy perhaps comes from the Greek for breathe, and Mandius, I understand, will come from the Greek to rule. I presume that's where we get our modern day word mandate from. So this opens up an abundance of interpretations here, where we can suggest his awareness of his ruling power, his mandate, his mandius, will only last as long as his breaths, his ability to breathe, his life, therefore suggesting that whatever power he has is also temporary, is also perhaps fragile. Sentence starter number 2, paragraph number 2, is ultimately just going to be talking about the theory of time. Time and the power of time is a theme or an idea about which you can discuss any of these poems. Time is something that comes up as an area that you can use to compare amongst all of these poems. So all I'm doing here, everybody, is thinking, how is time presented in both poems and how can I compare them? What I'm suggesting as follows, everybody. My second paragraph would start off like this. Both poets emphasise the impermanence of physical materials. So that means that they are not always completely permanent and going to last forever, against the forces of time. Both poems are suggesting that nothing lasts forever, and our attempts to try and build something that we feel may do so are foolish. So what's my evidence for this, examiner? Well, again, if we think about tissue, and therefore the idea of paper in this poem being a metaphor for human power, as it says there, paper is used as an extended metaphor for human power, well, that suggests that both are fragile, transient, that means affected by the forces of time, and non-permanent, A piece of paper will eventually fold up, get frayed, become yellow, degrade over time. So the poem is therefore a meditation, surely, on human power, highlighting how fragile it is in contrast to the effects of time and nature. We'll talk about nature in a minute. This idea of how a physical material is impermanent and cannot outlast time is perhaps more simply, you may argue, but I would suggest not as excitingly portrayed in Ozymandias. We hear of the legs of stone. How impressive. But these legs of stone of Ozymandias are prefaced by the adjectives vast and trunkless, I should say, as well as a half-sunk visage in the sands of the desert. So how incredible that this once mighty statue, which towered 30, 40, 50 feet up into the air perhaps, is now completely and utterly destroyed. It is nothing more than a shattered visage that is trunkless. Sentence starter number 3, paragraph number 3. If the question is how poets present ideas about power, well, maybe both poets are portraying a corrupting sense of power. There is a sense of arrogance with Ozymandias that his power will last forever. Versus, or in contrast to the idea in Tissue, which is that power, in this case metaphorically represented as paper, is temporary, but we still allow it to control our lives. So there's a slight difference there, everybody, which suggests that power can be a quite corrupting force that affects us in a slightly negative way. In Ozymandias, it's portrayed as something that can make us very arrogant. We think that we are very, 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 very powerful indeed if we are just a hint of power. Slightly different in Tissue, where we allow power to kind of overtake us, to kind of control our lives, but not in an arrogant way. So quite a big idea, but hopefully the evidence that I then go through for the examiner would support what's possibly quite an ambitious idea. In Tissue, we hear how the grocery shop receipts portrayed in the simile that they fly our lives like paper kites. That suggests we're controlled by paper. That suggests we're quite controlled by notions of power. So the power that comes with money, or the power that comes with resources that we need to live, they end up actually in the end controlling our lives. So just as I read that on the page, everybody, you might argue, in fact, that power is in fact a quite limiting force, or that certain types of power are a quite limiting force for us. We end up getting controlled by other things, the need to eat, the need to have money to live, that in fact limits our arrogance, you may argue. This is very different to Ozymandias, where the monosyllabic delivery of nothing beside remains, and the plosive alliteration of the desert being boundless and bare, all follow his triumphant proclamation that we should look upon his works and despair. Those words from Ozymandias were, of course, second-hand. They are portrayed to us by a travelling nomad, somebody who travels far over an antique land, meaning that his arrogance is limited even further. Perhaps indeed we should feel happy that his arrogance and his power has not outlived nature, and that his sneer of cold command, that harsh alliteration combining with the plosive alliteration, all in all making us happy that he has been defeated. So an ambitious idea there, everybody, but then Tissue is a pretty ambitious, but I think very rewarding poem to read, whereby I am suggesting that both poets are implying how power can in fact corrupt us, but they're both suggesting it in different ways. Ozymandias, or Shelley I should say, is writing about how power can have an effect whereby we may become arrogant if we have too much of it, quite unlike Tissue, whereby it can end up controlling us. It can end up as a force perhaps used by other people to limit what we can do with our lives. We need the power in our lives, but it can end up controlling us to some extent. So that one felt like quite a big, intense idea, and that's another reminder of something I should have said at the beginning of this video, and which I say in every single one of these videos, which is that there are some ideas here you will gel with and can imagine writing about, others you can't. And if you can't imagine writing about any of these ideas, please, please, please do not do so. There's no right or wrong answer. These are just a range of ideas that have been collected over the years that hopefully will be, for the most part, I hope helpful, but goodness knows if some of them you just can't quite get your head around. That's absolutely understandable and quite fine. Here is one, however, that hopefully is a little bit more straightforward. So if tissue were to come up in the exam, here is one that I think would still garner high marks and you may be able to do something with. Topic sentence 4, paragraph 4. The forms and the structure of both poems indicate the different feelings that each poet has about power. So in Tissue, we have a free, loose form of the poem with its drifting enjambment, its lack of rhyme scheme, all of which appears to be an attempt to resist any restrictions over people, or an attempt to try and resist the idea that there is a powerful force out there that can contain us and that can control us. So completely different, for example, to London with its strict A-B rhyme scheme. And therefore, to some extent, London being one example, there are many others, and to some extent, therefore, surely also different to Ozymandias. The formal sonnet form that Ozymandias uses is, on one hand, restrictive, but the fact that his subject is not about love, and he borrows from several historical sonnet forms, what I mean by that, everybody, is he combines a range of different sonnets, he combines a range of different styles of sonnet to produce his own sonnet, subtly suggests that his power is not permanent and can be modified and changed over time, emphasising the ideas that power over others isn't going to last. So, topic sentence number 5, which is all about the power of nature. So again, nature, just like time, is an idea that comes up in so many of these poems. So all we try to do here, everybody, is try and think about how they are both portrayed in these two poems and what is the very, very good comparison that we can make about them. Well, hopefully it is this, and hopefully you'll think that this is a good one. Both poems appear to emphasise how the power of nature and its effects over time will outlast the power of humans. Just a nice way of basically saying the power of nature is greater than the power of humans. So in Tissue, what's my evidence, examiner? Well, humans try to exert their power over nature. We hear in a long list in stanza 5 about the sun, the rivers, the mountains. But where is that being mentioned? That's all being mentioned in stanza 5 with a map, and how the map is there, and the map is trying to capture and contain onto one piece of paper all of these natural features that have grown over time. I should say grown over millions of years. You know, mountains and rivers, I presume, take millions and millions of years to, as it were, be produced or to manifest themselves. But the fact that there are borderlines and there are mountain folds, we're trying very hard to sort of imprint ourselves or at least overpower nature by trying to capture it onto a map. And the implication I'm suggesting is that that is particularly ineffectual as well as ineffective. And so Tissue, my paragraph continues, it seems to imply that the structures we build, many of which are mentioned towards the end of the poem, such as monoliths and citadels, as well as our own human experiences. Line 31, the shapes that pride can make, where line 32, we try to raise a structure, are never meant to last, and they should be allowed to eventually drift away with quiet dignity. The use of the word drift there, a direct quote from line 14. So if we remember that this extended metaphor of paper is all about human power, then the power of our opinions and our beliefs can often drift too. And this is emphasized further by the end, where we learn, as I just said earlier, I'm repeating myself slightly, where we learn that we are structures never meant to last. So to resist this idea, to try and say, no, my power is so great and so fantastic, it's going to last forever, surely goes against the natural order of time. That is a big, meaty idea there, everybody, where I'm basically trying to say that the poet is acknowledging how we do great things with our lives, and we should be very proud of the great things that we do with our lives, building capitals, building monoliths, tracing grand designs with living tissue, but never forget, line 34, you are not so powerful it's going to last forever. Line 34 tells us that it was never meant to last. And the phrasing of that line, that it was never meant to last, says that any attempt to try and make it last is against the natural order of things. Wow, that's why I love this poem. I just think it's utterly brilliant. And so this idea that I think the poet wonderfully portrays there, that we are capable of building and doing great things, but don't forget, they won't last forever, so please don't be so arrogant that you think they will. That exact same idea comes across in Ozymandias, so my paragraph will continue. This is similar to Ozymandias, where we hear towards the end of that poem about a boundless and bare desert that is made up of lone and level sounds. Both of these sentences use alliteration to emphasize and elongate boundless, lone, level, to elongate the scale of time that eventually supersedes humans, that eventually overtakes them. And whereas the poet of Tissue, Darker, she claims that, be acknowledging of the fact that the power will not last forever, Ozymandias ignores her message. Ozymandias does try to resist this idea. He does try and say, look at my works, ye mighty in despair. He does try and claim that his power will last forever. The result is the foolishness of the arrogant ruler. The result is the Volta that we get 2/3 of the way through the poem, where we rather comically are told nothing beside remains. Okay, well done if you're still with me. We are on the 6th sort of suggested sentence starter here. So again, a reminder that there's hopefully enough for about 2 essays worth here. So hopefully there's something that you're gelling with on what I know is quite an ambitious poem, but in my view, not an impossible one. Here I'm just going to use the idea of religion to compare the 2 poems. So again, just like the idea of time, just like the idea of nature, the idea of religion is something that I think we can get in all of these poems. So why not try and think of a comparison between them, because the examiner, I hope, would be rewarded, or you would be rewarded by the examiner if you did. So here I'm suggesting that both poets, this is my sentence starter, this is the beginning of my paragraph, both poets appear to emphasize how the power of religion is one that is greater than humans. In Tissue, all the way through, surely we have a semantic field of light that shines through everything. It penetrates everything, right from line 2 all the way through to line 16, where the sun shines through, all the way through to line 29, where the daylight breaks through capitals and monoliths. So the repetition of transparent that we have at the very beginning of the poem, as well as at the very end in the penultimate line, has a double meaning. It means to be see-through, but it also means to be honest. Perhaps the poet is claiming that religion will penetrate any dishonesty from those who are arrogant to presume they can rule forever. It will even break, as I said earlier in line 29, which is the one and only violent verb in the poem, through modern-day man-made constructions that symbolize power. So we might try to build a big, mighty, enormous structure, but there is a background spiritual presence that will subtly make its presence known upon it. And I think the reference to tracing a grand design on line 32 is key. almost as if we search for religious meaning in this world, or at the very least, everybody, you might not think it's religious meaning, but perhaps it is meaning to do with the origins of things. Where do we come from? How did the world begin? And we often, perhaps at times, drift through life trying to find a definitive answer. So I'm suggesting to everybody that there is, a lot of language that is to do with religion in tissue, and I'm suggesting that what the poet is claiming is that there is this religious or at least spiritual presence that runs throughout the poem. I think that's slightly different to the religion that we find in Ozymandias. We have a misplaced sense of trying to copy God when he claims, "I am King of Kings." That is very different to the rather subtle, unassuming presence of religion in tissue. Here, it's rather being exploited in an aggressive way by Ozymandias to claim he is almost like a god. And the violence of the sneer and the stamped, unlike the lack of violence in tissue, where I said, as far as I can tell, there's only really one violent verb in tissue, which is the idea of the daylight breaking. We've got lots of violent verbs in Ozymandias. Sneer, stamped are just two. That also suggests that Ozymandias was not benevolent. That means, all kind. That means very, very kind, basically, which is clearly what one would hope to have from a god or a religious presence in one's life. Okay, everybody, well done if you've made it this far. Here's the sort of seventh idea that I would have for a paragraph. Again, it's not totally straightforward, but, we really want to push up the mark scheme and really try and stun the examiner so that when they're reading this answer, they're thinking, wow, that's a really good one. Right, here we go. At times, tissue curiously and complexly enmeshes the power of paper and humankind, suggesting both are complementary, intertwined, and will always be enjoined. It is natural for humankind to want to have power, and we should not try to resist it. What does that mean? That's just a lot of really nice language that sounds really, really good, which basically says that in tissue, the poet is presenting the idea that human beings will always have or want a desire to have power in their lives, which may sound like a bit of a basic and obvious thing to say, but the evidence I'm going to give you shows how she sort of suggests humans and power are joined together. It's not like humans ruthlessly seek out power. It's not like human beings are born without power and have to ruthlessly grab it in order to dominate other people. I'm suggesting here, everybody, or I will with my evidence, that in tissue, she is suggesting that it's just a natural part of our lives. It's a natural part of our existence. The good language, I suppose, is that it's just a natural part of our constitution. So I've used words here like enmesh, intertwined, enjoined, and hopefully that's going to make sense with the evidence that I'm then going to put forward. I'm suggesting, everybody, though, just going towards the end of the third line of the start of this paragraph, Shelley, however, marks a distinct difference between humans and power. Too much of it is damaging to humans and unnatural. So hopefully you notice the subtle distinction I'm making there. Darker is implying that it is natural for human beings to have power. It's just part of who we are, quite unlike Shelley, who suggests that there is an imbalance and that we rather ruthlessly pursue too much of it and it can damage us. Wow. What is my evidence for that? Well, in tissue, in the first three stanzas, we have an intertwining, by which I mean a sort of mixing up of images of paper with tactile language. So if something is tactile, it can be easily touched or it can be easily handled. So we would say, for example, that a mound of clay is tactile. It's something that we can sort of mould and fashion in our own image. So there's loads of that, isn't there? We hear in line 4 how paper is thinned by touching. We hear about line 6 where a hand has written in the names and histories in the back of the Quran. In line 11, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. What I'm basically saying there, everybody, is that there's loads of language at the beginning where human beings are taking great care to physically handle paper. They are attracted to it and they are carefully handling it and nurturing it, you may argue, and looking after it. They're just naturally attracted to it. And we hear towards the end how this paper could be used to build citadels and monoliths. An architect could use all of this paper to build again with brick or block and let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. So what we're saying there is that an architect, i.e. a human who wants to do something with their life, they could use paper, i.e. a metaphor for human power, to produce something absolutely amazing, but the implication is you shouldn't be too powerful, you shouldn't be too proud, you shouldn't be too arrogant, because it won't ever last forever. It will drift away and fall away on a sigh, as she says on line 15. And we get that, we get a curious enjambment break at the end in the final line when we hear about all this paper is turned into your skin. So that's what I mean, everybody, by all of that lovely language at the beginning, that she enmeshes the power of paper and humankind. She intertwines the power of paper and humankind. She enjoins it. She basically, to put it more simply, she just fuses it together or joins it together. The idea that power and human beings are just all part of the same thing. It's just part of our constitution. And that's why she gives that final emphatic enjambment break to the final line. So we really get that idea of paper that has turned into your skin. It's part of who you are. Goodness me. Where do we get that slightly differently in Ozymandias, where we have we've had all that tactile language and tissue. We sort of have similarly tactile language in Ozymandias. The sculptor well read the physical face of Ozymandias. He was able to really get a likeness of what Ozymandias looked like when he was chiseling him away to produce that statue. We hear that there was a hand that mocked them. So there's an idea of sort of hands that are, dealing with matter that will then be turned into big, powerful things. So it's also tactile, but not used in a way that suggests this is benign, this is quite gentle, or natural, which I would suggest tissue does. There is a motive behind it. And that motive is surely unnatural. That motive is not particularly pleasant. The motive is to suppress others, because the sculptor well read that sneer of cold command, was able to produce a statue that had a hand that mocked them. So this is an especially complex idea here, everybody, which is effectively saying that both poems are slightly different, that whereas Darker says that power is something that is natural and something that we will eventually surely want to use, and we should perhaps use it in a positive way, but be careful because it won't ever last forever, so don't get too arrogant. Ozymandias is slightly different, also using tactile language, but in a way that suggests it can be abused and therefore used in a non-natural way. Wow, goodness me, that is a lot of complex information there, everybody. But hopefully it is giving you, at the least, one or two, I rather hope more than two, hopefully 4 or 5, ideas that you could imagine writing up in as your own paragraphs. What can I say? None of it is straightforward or simple, but unfortunately getting a high grade is always going to be presented as a mighty challenge. Final thing on the screen now is an introduction. People always ask me, how can I do my introduction? What should I put in my introduction? Here is a good example where I hope to have summed up everything that we've just gone through in as fewer sentences as possible, dropping in context here, there, and everywhere. I will leave this up. You should have a read of this if you wish and consider whether there are parts here that you could imagine doing. All I will say is that this took me a long time to write. Trying to sum up absolutely everything that an ambitious essay is going to go through in a couple of sentences is not easy. But if you're looking for a really good introduction, I rather hope that this is an example of one. Well done, everybody. Not easy, but hopefully there is enough for 2 essays that we've just gone through there. Goodbye.